Welcome to the Deep Dive, everybody. Today we're diving into the birth of the U.S. Constitution. We've got, a whole bunch of sources. They're like firsthand accounts, heated debates, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
It gives us like a front row seat to this whole process. Let's start with America's first, go at this whole governance thing. The Articles of Confederation. Our sources kind of paint it as, like a ship with a rudder but no sails.
The articles were intentionally designed to create a weak central government.
Right.
Yeah. The states were so afraid of replicating that strong, powerful authority they just fought to, get away from.
Yeah, makes sense.
But the problem was it created a government that was practically paralyzed. I mean, imagine, right, a government that can't even collect taxes
Whoa.
to fund essential services, right? Or regulate commerce between the states. It created economic chaos. It couldn't even raise an army effectively, for the national defense.
That's like trying to build a house on sand, no foundation.
Exactly.
So it sounds like Shays' Rebellion was a pretty stark illustration of those weaknesses then, right?
It was a wake-up call.
Yeah.
Big time. This group of farmers, burdened by debt and facing property seizures, they actually took up arms.
Wow.
Against the Massachusetts government.
So this was like an armed rebellion.
Yeah.
Wow.
Led by, Daniel Shays, a Revolutionary War veteran.
Okay, so this wasn't just a bunch of disgruntled people. These were people who knew how to...
This was serious.
To fight.
Yeah. It showed just how weak the government really was. Couldn't maintain order, couldn't protect its citizens. And a lot of leaders started to think, okay, we need a more robust national government.
I mean, that makes sense. If your government can't even, keep the peace, then what's the point?
Right.
So Shays' Rebellion basically forced everyone back to the drawing board.
Pretty much.
And that led to the Constitutional Convention in 1787.
That's right. 55 delegates.
Wow.
From 12 states. All these different perspectives, different interests. And they meet in Philadelphia during a scorching summer.
Oh, that's got to be uncomfortable, yeah.
Really uncomfortable.
So what were they trying to do? Just fix up the Articles of Confederation?
Well, that was the initial idea.
Okay.
To amend them.
Yeah.
But they quickly realized they needed a complete overhaul, like a brand new structure for the government.
Okay. So it wasn't just like a little tweaking here and there.
No, this was starting from scratch.
Scrap the whole thing. It's kind of amazing to imagine all those, brilliant minds crammed in one room, just hashing it all out.
Yeah.
And we can't forget, George Washington, the hero of the Revolution, was there too, right?
Yeah, presiding over the whole thing. Give the convention a real sense of gravity, legitimacy.
Right, like if Washington's there, it must be important.
Exactly. And his presence helped to keep things, kind of on track, especially with all the intense debates and compromises happening. I mean, James Madison was there too.
Oh, right, the father of the Constitution.
The father of the Constitution.
She played a big role, right?
A huge role in shaping the document, advocating for a stronger federal system.
Gotcha. So, I mean, there must have been some pretty heated arguments going on.
Right.
Like what were some of the main sticking points?
Well, one big issue was representation. How each state would be represented in the new government.
Okay. So how much, say, each state would have.
Exactly.
Makes sense.
And there was a big divide between the larger states and the smaller states. The larger states, like Virginia, they wanted representation based on population, which, of course, would give them more power.
Right.
But the smaller states, like New Jersey, they were worried about being overshadowed.
Yeah, I can see that.
They wanted equal representation for every state, regardless of size.
So how did they resolve that? That sounds like it could have just been a complete deadlock.
They came up with this brilliant compromise, a bicameral legislature. So Congress would be divided into two chambers.
Okay.
You have the House of Representatives, where representation is based on population, like the larger states wanted.
Right.
And then you have the Senate, where each state gets 2 senators, no matter how big or small.
Okay. So both sides got something they wanted.
Exactly. It was a way to balance the interests of both the people and the states.
Pretty ingenious, actually.
It really was a testament to their ability to find common ground, even on really fundamental issues.
But, I mean, there was another big issue that they couldn't ignore, right?
Yeah.
Slavery.
The elephant in the room.
How did they even begin to address that?
It was the most contentious issue. I mean, the southern states, their economies were built on enslaved labor.
Right.
They wanted slaves to be counted when it came to representation in the House.
So they could get more power.
Exactly.
But I imagine the northern states weren't too happy about that.
Many were advocating for abolition. They were vehemently opposed to the idea.
Yeah. So how did they find a compromise on something as, I mean, morally charged as slavery?
It was a compromise many see as deeply flawed. It's called the Three-Fifths Compromise.
A three-fifths compromise. What was that?
So each slave would be counted as 3/5 of a person,
Wow.
both for representation in the House and for determining taxation.
It's hard to believe that they actually,
It's a dark part of our history.
agreed to something like that.
Yeah, it allowed for the creation of a unified nation, but it also, perpetuated a horrific system. Set the stage for future conflict.
It's a stark reminder of the complexity of this era and the legacy that we're still grappling with today. But, I mean, they did manage to create a constitution.
They did.
It wasn't perfect, but it was a remarkable achievement. I mean, considering all those differences they had to bridge. But the debate didn't end there, right?
No.
Because once they had this document, they still needed to get the states to sign off on it.
Yeah, the battle for ratification.
And that's where the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists came in.
That's right. That's when it went from a debate among delegates to a nationwide debate.
So it was more than just about the Constitution itself.
Yeah, it was about the very nature of government.
Ah.
Like, how much power should the federal government have? How do we balance liberty with order?
So remind me, who were the Federalists again?
They were the ones who supported the Constitution. People like Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, John Jay, they believed in a strong central government. They thought it was necessary for unity, stability, and economic progress.
And the Anti-Federalists were against it.
They were deeply skeptical of centralized power.
Okay.
People like Patrick Henry, George Mason, they thought the Constitution would create a tyrannical government that would trample on states' rights, individual freedoms. They wanted stronger safeguards for individual liberties.
Gotcha. So this debate, it wasn't just like a polite disagreement, right? This was a real battle.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they were duking it out in newspapers, pamphlets, public forums. It was a war of words.
And that's where the Federalist Papers come in, right?
It's-
Those essays written to try and convince people to support the Constitution.
Yeah.
So what were they arguing in those essays?
They were explaining the principles of the Constitution, emphasizing the need for a more unified and powerful national government.
Yeah.
But the Anti-Federalists, they weren't buying it.
So what happened?
Well, the Anti-Federalists, they demanded some concrete guarantees. They wanted to make sure individual freedoms were protected.
Okay.
And that's how we got the Bill of Rights,
Ah.
the first 10 amendments to the Constitution.
So the Bill of Rights, it wasn't just some, like a bonus feature.
No. It was a crucial element in getting the Constitution ratified.
Interesting. And, I mean, what kinds of freedoms did it protect?
Oh, all the big ones. Freedom of speech, religion, the press, right to bear arms, protection from unreasonable searches and seizures, right to a fair trial, all the freedoms we often take for granted today.
Wow. It's pretty amazing to think about how this debate, from centuries ago is still relevant.
Yeah.
We're still arguing about a lot of these same issues today.
Exactly. It shows how those early decisions are still shaping our lives.
It's a testament to the foresight of those founders, right? That they created a system that's, flexible enough to adapt to changing times.
It's pretty remarkable when you think about it.
But let's back up a little bit and talk about the structure of the government that they created with this Constitution.
Yeah.
Because this blueprint, this system of checks and balances, separation of powers, it's been both praised and criticized over the years.
Oh, yeah.
But, I mean, it's endured for centuries.
It has. It's a testament to their vision, I think, that they could create a framework that's lasted this long and still, adapting to changing circumstances.
Yeah. I mean, it's still the basis for American democracy.
It is.
So let's break it down a little bit. Let's start with separation of powers.
Okay.
What does that mean?
So they divided the federal government into 3 distinct branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. Each branch has its own powers and responsibilities.
Right. So, no one branch can become too powerful.
Exactly. It's designed to prevent any one person or group from having too much control.
Okay, so that's separation of powers, and then there's checks and balances, right?
Okay.
And what is that?
Checks and balances is how each branch can limit or check the power of the other 2 branches.
Ah, okay, so it creates a kind of balance.
Yeah.
Dynamic equilibrium, that's how they say
Yeah,
it.
exactly.
Okay, so give me an example of that.
So the president can veto laws passed by Congress, but Congress can override that veto if they have a 2/3 majority vote.
Ah, okay, so they can overrule the president.
Yeah.
And what about the courts?
The courts can declare laws unconstitutional, but then Congress can propose amendments to the Constitution to change that.
Okay.
So it's this constant back and forth, right?
Right.
Each branch has the power to check the others.
It's like a delicate dance, almost.
It is.
So Congress makes the laws, the president puts them into action,
yeah.
and the courts make sure everything's, on the up and up. They're like the referees.
Yeah, exactly.
But, I mean, each branch has more specific responsibilities, right?
Oh, definitely.
So let's start with the legislative branch. What exactly does Congress do?
So Article 1 of the Constitution outlines all the powers in the structure of Congress.
Okay.
And like we talked about, Congress is bicameral.
Right. 2 chambers.
Right. The House of Representatives and the Senate.
Got it.
And this division ensures that both the people who are represented in the House and the states represented by the Senate have a say in the lawmaking process.
So the House is supposed to be more, responsive to the people, right?
Yeah, because their members are elected directly by the people, and they serve 2-year terms.
So they have to keep their constituents happy if they want to stay in office.
Exactly.
Makes sense. But the Senate, with those 6-year terms, they provide more stability.
Yeah, they can focus on the long term.
Right. It's interesting how they, balance that,
Right. The House is more reactive to the changes in public opinion, while the Senate can be a bit more deliberate.
Okay, so that's how they structured it. But what exactly does Congress do? What are their powers?
Well, they have a lot of powers.
Such as?
They can draft and pass legislation, they control federal spending, they can declare war, they raise and support the Army and Navy, regulate commerce between the states, establish a postal service. They even coin money.
Wow, that's a lot of power.
It is, but it's all defined and limited by the Constitution.
Right, so it's not just like they can do whatever they want.
No, there are boundaries.
And of course, the president can check them with that veto power.
Exactly. Keeps things in balance.
It's amazing how they built that in,
Yeah. It's a system designed to promote deliberation, to prevent hasty decisions.
So Congress makes the laws, but the president, he's the one who actually puts those laws into action.
He's the enforcer.
Right. So let's talk about the executive branch a little bit. What does Article 2 say about the president's role?
So Article 2, it basically says that the president is responsible for enforcing the laws passed by Congress,
Okay.
representing the nation on the world stage, being commander-in-chief of the armed forces.
So it's a pretty big job.
Oh, huge job. It requires leadership, decisiveness, understanding all those complexities of domestic and foreign policy.
Yeah, sounds like a lot of pressure. But the founders, they were careful to limit the president's power, too.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, definitely. They knew the dangers of too much power concentrated in one person.
Right.
They wanted to make sure the president, even with all that authority, was accountable to the other branches and ultimately to the people.
So the president enforces the laws, but also has a say in what those laws are.
Right. The president can propose legislation to Congress, and they can also veto bills they don't like.
So there's this back and forth between the executive branch and the legislative branch.
Exactly. Constant negotiation, compromise, finding that balance.
Checks and balances again.
Exactly.
But the president's powers, they go beyond just domestic affairs. Right?
Oh, yeah. Don't forget, the president is also the commander-in-chief.
Right, of the armed forces.
Exactly. So they play a huge role in national defense and foreign policy.
So they have to be a diplomat as well.
Exactly. They negotiate treaties, but those treaties have to be ratified by the Senate.
Checks and balances.
There it is again.
It's everywhere.
They appoint ambassadors, shape diplomatic relations, represent the nation's interests abroad. It's a complex job.
Yeah, I bet. But we can't forget about the third branch of government.
The judiciary.
The judicial branch.
Right. They interpret the laws and make sure they're in line with the Constitution.
They're like the guardians of the Constitution.
Exactly. They're essential for upholding the rule of law, protecting individual liberties.
Okay, so tell me more about that. What does Article 3 of the Constitution say about the judicial branch?
So Article 3 establishes the federal courts, and at the top is the Supreme Court.
The highest court in the land.
Exactly. They have the final say in legal disputes.
So how are the judges chosen?
The president nominates them, and the Senate has to confirm them.
Okay.
That way, both the executive and legislative branches have a say.
Checks and balances.
Exactly. And get this. Federal judges serve for life.
For life.
Unless they're impeached for misconduct.
Wow. That's a pretty big deal.
It is. It was intended to ensure an independent judiciary, free from political pressure, so they can make decisions based on the law, not on what's popular or who's in power.
So they don't have to worry about getting reelected.
Exactly. They can just focus on interpreting the Constitution and making sure justice is served.
So they decide cases, but they also have the power to declare laws unconstitutional.
Yeah, it's called judicial review.
Judicial review. And that's a check on the other branches.
Right. It ensures that no law, no matter how popular it might be, can contradict the Constitution.
So the Constitution is always the top dog.
Always.
It's pretty impressive, this system they came up with, All these checks and balances, separation of powers, independent judiciary. It's like a carefully crafted machine designed to prevent tyranny and protect liberty.
It really is.
But we've only scratched the surface here. There's so much more to explore.
Oh, absolutely. We haven't even gotten into the specifics of the Bill of Rights, the nuances of the legislative process, the challenges of being president, the evolving role of the judiciary.
Right. There's so much more to this story.
Yeah.
So let's take a little break. Absorb all this information and come back ready to dive even deeper into the fascinating world of the U.S. Constitution. Hey, everyone. Welcome back. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Awesome. Today, we're going to travel back to the early days of the United States, right after the Revolution.
Ah, yeah.
We're going to see how this brand new nation
Right.
tackled westward expansion, built those foundations of its government,
Yeah.
and started grappling with some tensions that feel surprisingly familiar even today.
Absolutely. It's a period full of dynamism. You see the seeds of so much of what America would become.
Right.
The good, the bad, and the complicated.
Exactly. And we've got some great sources to help guide us today.
Okay.
First up, we're heading to the wild frontier with the Northwest Ordinances.
Okay.
So imagine a vast, untamed territory just ripe for the taking.
Yeah.
That was the Northwest Territory in the late 1700s.
Mm-hmm.
And these ordinances were like the rule book
Right.
for how to settle it, create new states, and try to keep things in order.
And these weren't just some dusty old laws, They had a ripple effect that reached far beyond the frontier. These seemingly simple rules about dividing up the land actually had a huge impact on the shaping of the Bill of Rights.
Wow.
And even ignited the debate over slavery.
Oh, wow.
That would eventually tear the nation apart.
Talk about unintended consequences, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But before we get ahead of ourselves,
Sure.
let's break down these ordinances one by one.
Sounds good. Let's start with the Ordinance of 1784.
Okay.
This one divided the Western Territory into 10 self-governing districts, each with the potential to become a state once its population hit a certain number.
Okay.
But here's the catch.
Okay.
These new states could only have Republican governments
Right.
and had to stay part of the U.S. forever.
Forever.
Yeah, it really shows you how concerned the founders were
Right.
about keeping the nation unified after breaking away from Britain.
So it was all about laying down the law from the start.
Yes.
What about the actual land itself? How did they go about dividing that up?
Well, that's where the Land Ordinance of 1785 comes in. Picture this. They took this vast wilderness
Okay.
and carved it into these neat little 6-mile square townships, each divided further into 640-acre parcels.
Wow.
It was like a giant grid system overlaid on the wilderness.
Okay, I'm picturing it now. Who got all this land? Was it just a free-for-all?
Not exactly.
Yeah.
Some of this land was actually allocated to veterans of the Continental Army.
Oh, okay.
And get this, the amount they got was based on their rank.
What?
Can you imagine trying to explain that system today?
Talk about a unique compensation package.
Sure.
But it wasn't just about rewarding veterans, right? They also needed to raise money somehow.
Exactly. Remember, the new nation was practically broke.
Right.
Selling off this Western land was a major way for the government to raise much-needed funds.
I see.
It's almost like they were flipping houses, but on a massive continental scale.
It's fascinating to see how these practical concerns,
Yeah.
like needing to pay the bills,
Right.
really shaped these early policies.
Mm-hmm.
But I have to imagine this land grab wasn't without its problems.
You're absolutely right. Many Native American tribes rightfully didn't recognize the government's claim to this land.
Of course.
And this led to violent conflicts that sadly would continue for centuries.
Right.
The ordinances, while focused on expansion and organization,
Right.
also exposed this tragic flaw in the government's approach to Native American land rights.
Yeah.
It's a dark side of this period that we can't ignore.
Definitely a reminder that progress often came at a steep cost.
Yes.
So we've got the land divided, we've got the rules set.
Mm-hmm.
What was the final piece of the puzzle for these territories to become states?
That's where the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 comes in.
Okay.
It created a clear 3-stage process for areas northwest of the Ohio River to transition from territories to full-fledged states.
Okay.
But here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
This ordinance also included a Bill of Rights,
Really?
guaranteeing things like religious freedom, trial by jury,
Wow.
and protection against cruel and unusual punishment. Sound familiar?
It's like a mini preview of the Bill of Rights in the Constitution.
Exactly. The Northwest Ordinance's Bill of Rights was a direct inspiration.
Wow.
So these ordinances weren't just about dividing up land.
Right.
They were setting the stage for some of America's most fundamental values and principles.
It's amazing to see how these early decisions
Yeah.
had such a lasting impact.
Yeah.
So we've got the blueprint for westward expansion.
Mhm.
But what about the government itself? How do they actually get things running in this brand new nation?
Well, it's 1788 election season.
Okay.
And guess who was basically a shoo-in for the first president?
I mean, it has to be George Washington,
None
right?
other than General George Washington,
Yeah.
the hero of the Revolution.
Of course. It seems almost inevitable
Yeah.
in hindsight, but can you imagine the pressure he must have
And
felt?
now it's mind-boggling.
A brand new nation, a brand new government, and everyone's looking to him to lead the way.
It's starting from scratch, but luckily he didn't have to do it alone. Enter Alexander Hamilton, Washington's right-hand man and the mastermind behind the nation's financial system.
Hamilton always a fascinating figure.
Oh, yeah.
Didn't he have some pretty strong opinions about how the country should be run?
Oh, absolutely. Hamilton was a staunch Federalist.
Okay.
He believed in a strong centralized government
Right.
and a thriving economy powered by industry and trade.
So he was all about factories and bustling cities.
Yeah.
I'm guessing not everyone shared that vision?
You're right about that. That's where Thomas Jefferson enters the picture.
Okay.
He led the Democratic Republicans,
Right.
and his vision was very different.
Ah.
An agrarian republic where citizens were primarily independent, self-sufficient farmers.
Okay.
He saw those bustling cities and factories that Hamilton loved as potential threats to liberty and virtue.
Oh, so right from the start,
Yeah,
you have this clash between two fundamentally different visions of America.
exactly.
Big city versus small farm industry versus agriculture. Centralized power versus states' rights. It's a debate that in many ways continues to this day.
It's incredible how these early ideological battles continue to resonate in our politics.
Right.
But before we get too deep into that Hamilton-Jefferson showdown,
Okay.
let's shift gears for a moment. Remember, all this is happening while the French Revolution is unfolding across the Atlantic,
Right.
and the U.S. as a new nation
Yeah.
trying to find its place in the world gets caught in the crossfire.
Ah, yes. The French Revolution.
Yeah.
Didn't things get a little messy between the U.S. and France during that time?
They did. It led to what's known as the Quasi-War, an undeclared naval conflict.
Oh, wow.
And then there was the infamous XYZ affair,
Oh, yeah.
a bribery scandal involving French agents that outraged Americans.
Wow.
Imagine French agents demanding bribes from U.S. diplomats.
That's crazy.
It was a diplomatic nightmare.
Talk about an international incident. It sounds like something straight out of a spy thriller.
It definitely had its share of drama.
Yeah.
And while it might seem like a minor episode, the Quasi-War and the XYZ affair had a significant impact.
No, really?
It fueled growing tensions between the U.S. and France,
Clear?
setting the stage for future conflicts and shaping American foreign policy for years to come.
So they're dealing with all this international turmoil,
Yeah.
and at the same time, there's trouble brewing at home, too, right?
Unfortunately, yes. Fear and paranoia were running high.
Right.
Remember, this was a new nation
Right.
still finding its footing,
Mhm.
and the French Revolution had sparked anxieties about similar upheaval happening in the U.S.
Oh, I see.
And the Federalists, led by Hamilton,
Right.
used this atmosphere of fear to their advantage.
Okay.
They decided to, well, crack down.
Crack down. What do you mean by that?
They pushed through a set of laws known as the Alien and Sedition Acts.
Okay.
These were incredibly controversial laws that
Yeah.
targeted immigrants and anyone who dared to criticize the government.
Hold on. So in a nation founded on principles of free speech,
Right.
they pass laws making it illegal to criticize the government.
It sounds unbelievable, right?
Yeah.
But that's exactly what happened.
Mhm.
The Alien Act made it harder for immigrants to become citizens and
Mhm.
easier to deport them, especially if they were suspected of supporting the Democratic Republicans.
Wow.
And the Sedition Act.
Yeah.
That was even more blatant. It made it illegal to publish anything false, scandalous, and malicious against the government.
Wow.
Imagine that being thrown in jail simply for expressing your political views.
It's a stark contrast to the First Amendment's guarantee of free speech.
Yeah.
Didn't people push back against these laws?
They absolutely did. We'll dive into that resistance in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay.
But for now, it's important to understand just how divisive and controversial these acts were.
Right.
They raised serious questions about the limits of government power,
Yeah.
the fragility of civil liberties, and the very meaning of freedom in a democratic society.
Wow.
Questions that we still grapple with today.
For sure.
It's fascinating how these Alien and Sedition Acts really highlight that fundamental clash between Hamilton and Jefferson that we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
Hamilton, with his focus on a strong central government, was willing to go pretty far to silence dissent.
That's right. You mentioned that Hamilton had a whole vision for the U.S. economy.
Yeah.
Can you remind me what that was all about?
Sure. Hamilton, being the city guy that he was, laid out his vision in what he called the Report on Manufactures.
Okay.
He wanted to see America become a manufacturing powerhouse
Okay.
with a robust financial sector and a government led by what he considered the best and brightest, a well-educated elite.
So he wanted to turn the U.S. into an early industrial giant.
Yes.
How did he go about actually trying to make that happen?
He was all about action.
Okay.
He pushed through a bunch of bold economic policies, for example. He convinced the federal government to assume the debts that individual states had racked up during the Revolution. This centralized financial power, and in his view, tied the states' interests more closely to the success of the federal government.
Makes sense from a nation-building perspective, but I bet that didn't go over well with everyone.
We're catching it. States that had already paid off their debts weren't too happy about having to essentially bail out those that hadn't.
Right.
But Hamilton wasn't done yet. He also established a national bank, something that was quite controversial at the time.
Right.
And to raise revenue for the government, he imposed taxes like the infamous excise tax on whiskey.
Oh, yeah.
Remember those whiskey-loving farmers we talked about earlier?
Yeah. Yeah.
They weren't too thrilled about that one.
Yeah, I bet not. They practically revolted, right?
It wasn't quite a full-blown revolution, but there was definitely some serious pushback, which we called the Whiskey Rebellion.
Right.
It showed just how much some people resented what they saw as federal overreach into their lives.
So Hamilton's pushing for industry cities, a strong central government, and taxes that not everyone's happy about. All the while, Jefferson's over there shaking his head, I imagine.
Pretty much. Jefferson was horrified by what he saw as Hamilton's disregard for individual liberty.
Right.
And his embrace of big government.
Yeah.
Remember, Jefferson was all about that agrarian ideal, independent farmers, limited government states' rights.
Right.
He feared that Hamilton's vision would lead to corruption, inequality, and the erosion of the very values that the nation was founded on.
So it was a real battle of ideologies playing out on the national stage.
Exactly. And their rivalry wasn't just about philosophical debates. It led to the formation of the first political parties in the U.S.
Really?
The Federalist Party, led by Hamilton, and the Democratic Republican Party, led by Jefferson.
Wow. So the two-party system that we know today goes all the way back to these two guys.
You got it. And the debates they had back then about the balance of power,
Right.
the role of government individual rights versus collective good, they're still echoing in our politics today.
Wow.
It's remarkable how relevant those early arguments remain.
It's like we're still trying to figure out which vision of America we want to embrace.
Right.
It's a great note to end on a reminder that history is not just something we study.
Mm-hmm.
It's something we live, it's something we shape, something we pass on.
So keep exploring, keep questioning, keep engaging with the past, because the more we understand where we've been, the better equipped we are to chart a course for where we want to go.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the early United States. We hope you've learned something new, maybe sparked some curiosity, and perhaps even discovered some aha moments of your own. Until next time, keep learning, keep thinking, and keep diving deep.